Welcome to Uncomfortable, conversations about culture and Christianity. My name is Eric, and today I'm joined by Jess.
Hello, world.
And Alex.
To infinity and beyond.
I've heard that somewhere. It's very catchy.
Well, she said hello, world, and I was trying to greet everybody else.
Oh, beyond.
Beyond the world.
Beyond infinity, even.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's something. We have a little bit of housekeeping right here at the top of this episode. This is going to be our last episode for about 4 weeks.
Yep.
We're going to take in the month of July off, which if you've been around for a while, that's kind of been a rhythm we've had. So it gives us time to, collect ourselves.
Think about the fall.
Think about the future.
Accept feedback. So if you have feedback on, I know like adding the headlines segment was because people had some feedback and thoughts, and so we'd love to hear it.
Yeah, maybe their feedback is, you should remove the headlines segment.
Maybe we'll send out.
Who knows?
Candy.
Or also show ideas, right?
Yeah.
Topics you want us to cover.
If you want to be on here, and it's okay. We know there's people that we've discovered secretly would like to.
That's true.
Be on. And if that's you, you got to give us a reason, like a topic or, something you're an expert at, and maybe we can arrange it.
Could be an expert at lots of things.
Yep. We have had lots of experts.
Yeah.
Okay.
Anything else going on? Anything else we feel like we need to?
No. Well, I do. We should probably mention. So this is our last episode of, before we take a break, and we have had it scheduled with a guest.
Yeah.
Who was unable to make it. So COVID is real. So he is someone in his family
stopping things.
Yeah, someone in his family has COVID, and so he called us last night. And he's like, I can't be there, which is obviously a bummer for us because we're looking forward to that conversation, which we'll be able to have a little bit later on this fall. But it also leaves us kind of like, all right, what are some ideas that people have sent us, and how do we start to discuss those a little bit more on the fly? And so
here we go.
Listen with more grace, or just stop listening because you're like, there are going to be a lot of rambling today. So we'll see.
Wow. Do we never ramble? What are you talking about?
I don't, but
yeah. Oh, okay.
Mostly.
I'm not going to be self-deprecating.
You are.
I love when we pitch it and to see what God does with things like this. So
yeah, it's always exciting. It's a little bit of an adventure, and we're
just like that mustache.
While the CWS is here, pinch hitting is good. Okay, so good job. Way to bring it back around
to the College World Series. Have you made it out to any of the games yet?
I have not.
No.
I got invited,
have you?
But I haven't.
Not yet. Where my wife works, a lot of times she'll get emails from people giving out tickets, just and so I've got my fingers crossed. Maybe I'll make it. But.
I'm in a mom's group, as most moms are, on Facebook, and somebody posted in there. They said, we just moved here this week, and we moved down, they moved into the Creighton area, and they were like, nobody told us that Nebraska had so much traffic, and it was so busy, and there were so many people in cars. And somebody was like, it's the College World Series, and they were like, what's the College World Series? So they just thought that they moved here, and Omaha was crazy busy. But it's just that time of year. We all know that all of us that live here.
It's true. Can be bad, but it's, it's a special thing.
Special.
It's a pride point that we have here in Omaha.
Amen.
Yeah. All right. That's it for this portion of the podcast. Up next, we've got headlines. All right, our headline today comes from Yahoo.com, Yahoo News. It says Pixar's Lightyear disappoints at the box office. I did notice it is one of their lower rated on Rotten Tomatoes for Pixar movies. I have not seen this yet. Have you seen it? Anybody here?
Nope. Full disclosure, have not seen it. There has obviously been a lot of buzz about the movie. And I had someone ask that it's not something we often comment on as movies, but I think we talked about Turning Red, maybe a month or two ago now, and this one has obviously turned some heads because of some of the stuff in the show. And so I think this person was asking, as a cartoon, if you haven't heard, there's a kiss between two women in this, and so there's been a lot of backlash as it's been produced of like, at one point the producers were going to take that scene out, and then, you know, a lot of people are like, no, you can't, that represents, you know, our community. And so there's just been a lot of that. And then obviously a boycott. I think Christians, not as a whole, I didn't want to say that represent, but there has been like pushback, you know, and of that kind of stuff because of that kiss between two women. I think it's the first time probably any Disney movies had like, or at least a cartoon, a child movie has had a same-sex affection kiss type of thing happening. And so anytime you're in new territory, there's going to be much to debate. So.
Yeah. I mean, I watched the clip of that scene. It was incredibly quick peck on the lips between two older women at a birthday party. Didn't seem to be quite the world-shaking thing that I thought, but then again, a lot of times this stuff gets pretty blown out of proportion. It could have just been a customary greeting in some cultures, I'm sure. I think I always go back to with this stuff is we color what our kids see so much more than what they gather from the information around them. I mean, especially when it comes to sexuality stuff or even, you know, curse word, what's a bad word or what's like, it's our reaction to it. It's how we react to them seeing something. It's how we talk about it. It's like so much of that is what we're responsible for as parents. And I think it's just interesting because we have so many hangups and we have so much baggage and we have so many preconceived ideas about things, and then we like kind of pass that on to our kids. And I mean, a kid watching a movie and seeing that scene, I don't think they're not gonna draw too many conclusions from it on their own, I wouldn't think. But I don't know, kids are incredible. They can figure out a lot of stuff. But I just think sometimes as parents, we when, you know, like I know when my kids were little, if we were watching something and someone said a bad word, we just never reacted to it. We just would try to keep a straight face and just kind of ignore it. Nothing ever came of it. But the moment you were like, oh no, they said a bad word, and then the curiosity radars start going off with kids. They're like, oh, what's that? This is bad. This is something, you know, and they're gonna want to investigate. They want to learn more about it. I want to know why mom and dad are freaking out about this thing. And it's like so many times I think we don't realize how responsible we are for what our kids understand. And I think here again, I mean, totally understand wanting to protect your kids from something. Like if that's every parent's prerogative. But I also think it's like how we go about that.
Yeah. I know for me after the Turning Red, and I think I admitted this, like, yeah, that's a movie probably I wish I would have been more proactive to like know a little bit more about before watching it with my kids, just so I could know what kind of spots to maybe watch their reactions for instead of like feeling like, oh, did they just miss it? And so like, just so I could be sensitive to that. And so I did, I haven't seen it like I mentioned earlier, but went and looked at, you know, this scene and wanted to like watch it. So if you're curious about it, I would encourage you. You can go on TikTok or, you know, the internet and you could find the scene. I'm sure someone pirated it and videotaped it or whatever, or maybe used it legally. I don't know, but you can go watch it. And I think it does set you up to like have those conversations. And to me, it's a matter of, you know, I think indoctrination is a word that kind of gets used inside of this, and people are, you know, afraid of the Disney agenda to indoctrinate kids. And it's hard for me to like fully find that happening in something like this, like that they have this purpose to like fully indoctrinate our kids with a specific agenda. They do have they have an agenda, one, make money and to appeal to culture. And like, that's how you're going to make money. And this has become a more normative part of our culture, you know, as, you know, whether we like or disagree with, or wherever we stand ourselves morally on things like this, it's representing culture. And I think for parents, like, I don't like, I want to have those conversations with my kids. I want them to experience some of that in the safety net of parenting so we can talk about it, you know? I mean, and instead of them seeing like it in public, you know, and that being shocking to them because it's not normative to their experiences of like, hey, mom and dad, you're the ones we see kiss, and that's where we see affection happen. Like I want to like, experience that with my kids in a place that's going to be where we can have those kind of conversations. And so, again, that's where I think I'm at with it.
I also think it's like, as far as how I'm looking at all this is like, this is another reminder to me that I'm kind of learning as I go, as a parent, as a Christian. Like, these are all things that we all have to wade through and make our own conclusions for ourselves. And for me, like, knowing my kids and the ages that they're at, I know cognitively they do not understand, nor are they thinking about sexuality like I'm thinking about sexuality, and they're not perceiving things in a way that I'm perceiving. So I love what you said, Eric, because I think we can tend to project our opinions or our reactions onto kids, but I know that my kids cognitively are not going to be able to communicate what I can, but they will mimic my behaviors, and so they'll pick up on statements and things like that. So I think for me, it's okay. Morally, do I want them to watch this? Like, I think for Turning Red, we kind of discussed that was like a one and done movie. So I think that, I don't know, it's something that I'm like still thinking through, because I feel like Buzz Lightyear, like my kids love Buzz Lightyear and they love Toy Story. And so it's something that we're going to see more. And so I don't know. I watched the scene and I was like, I don't even know if my kids at 5 and 8 are going to notice it. It's like, and it's so fast. I don't know if they'll notice it. We're planning on, like, we already had plans, because I learned about this today. Like, I haven't heard this. So even like in Christian circles, like, I'm, as far as like what I'm looking at, like, I hadn't heard this till today, but we already have plans to see it. So
well, and it's just
it's kind of a reminder of like, okay, how do I want to be engaging in culture, and also being cognizant of like how our kids are perceiving it, and it's like we also have to balance like how our friends and loved ones are seeing our reactions.
Well, and aside from this movie, if you live your kids are not always going to be just completely protected from this. If they were to see a same-sex couple in public give each other a kiss on the lips for a millisecond, and if you talk to them about this in a way that this is so bad and just awful thing, and I'm so sorry you saw that, like, you made it into this big deal, like, how do you expect them to react to others in that situation? Are they going to be like, oh, mommy, look at this, those people are being bad, and they're sinning, or whatever this is? It's like, how do we balance that to where we're not just making these small humans that are just going out there and being judgmental and just always looking for the wrong in the world? And it's like, it's not that we can debate that, and I think we're going to later on in this conversation today, but it's just like, I just think we have to be very cautious about what we're teaching them to value, and that we need to love people, and that we are not in control of the choices that they make or the decisions that they are in control of, and so it's like, how can we do that? I mean, I get it. It's a scary world out there, and there's a lot of things out there we want to protect our kids from, but man, I don't know that overreacting about this stuff. I mean, maybe the movie hasn't been doing well at the box office, so maybe that is people sending a message. Maybe they all heard about this and they aren't going to the movie. That could be. I don't know.
Yeah, and I think there's other reasons. I mean, I think, people like Tim Allen was the voice. There's nostalgia to this, and people are like, I don't, and they don't understand like the whole concept and all that kind of stuff. So there's a lot of reasons it could be doing poorly in the box office. But I do think, overall, parents, I mean, it's our job to parent and to be proactive and to have these difficult conversations with our kids and to look for opportunities to do this. But man, if Disney is raising your kids, then I wouldn't advise that. There's hardly any like one entity that I would say wholesale, that's who should raise your kids, And so we have to just be aware and on guard that there is an enemy out there, and he'll find in good culture and whatever we deem bad culture, he'll find ways to distort, people and identity and our thoughts about people. And so we always have to be, as parents, on guard and watching those things and be ready to listen to the Holy Spirit and be proactive about it. And so I would encourage that, whether it's this movie or Coco Melon, there's all of those things.
Oh no.
Putting Coco Melon on blast right now?
Well, I'm just.
Go ahead. I have seen controversy around Coco Melon
I have not
recently
seen
about
any
how
of
they
it.
transition their the scenes so quickly that it overstimulates babies, and that's why they can keep attention. That's we're opening a whole nother can of worms. There's lots of fans of Coco Melon.
When my kids were at that age that they would watch Coco Melon, it didn't exist, but Yo Gabba Gabba was a thing, and I loved that show. I loved watching Yo Gabba Gabba with them, and so many parents were like, "That show is awful. You shouldn't let your kids watch that." But man, that show was great. They had good guests, and anyways, yeah, it's we're all gonna have to make tough decisions here and there, and hopefully we just do our best. Up next, we're going to be talking about legislating morality, what that means. Stick around for that. Legislating morality. That is the topic today. Like we said at the top of the show, this one kind of came last minute because we had a guest scheduled for today, kind of had to move things around. And this theme has definitely been all over the headlines and culture as we wrestle through things like Roe versus Wade, gun control, vaccines, on and on and on and on. I think it would be good, though, to start out by defining morality, or at least legislated morality. It's defined as principles concerning the distinction between right and wrong or good and bad behavior. Where...
I feel
it's one of those things where it's like I think people will get feedback sometimes that they'll say, well, it seems like you're choosing your words carefully, or why didn't you say this, or why didn't you say that? And I think it's one of those things that there's so much intentionality that can go into these conversations, but we just have to be careful because I might say something and you might not understand what my heart behind it, And I think, and then to some extent that argument can be kind of thought of, people could say, oh, you're just passing the blame and you really meant to say whatever. But I do think we want to be considerate of other viewpoints because a lot of these issues can be kind of morally gray areas. And so even defining morality, it's like, are we going to have a philosophy lesson right now and talk about morals and morality and what that means? And are we talking about biblical morality or societal morality? I mean, it could go on and on and on. So we're going to try to do our best to define that by this very loose definition.
Yeah, and I think we see it, happening when we, like that conversation we had earlier about a movie, and obviously we get into the LGBTQ plus and rights and things like that is, and you alluded to it earlier, Eric, it's everywhere, this idea, and it seems to be a talking point or a point of leverage or contention for whomever doesn't want maybe a law, because when we're talking about legislation, obviously we're talking about laws that go into effect that would affect, in some way, whether that's, drinking and driving, that's illegal. There's a blood alcohol content. Speed limits, it's governing in some ways, and that's the job of our government, to govern a people who, for whatever reason, we can't fully govern ourselves. And so I think there's wisdom, and Scripture talks about...
Unless you're a libertarian.
Yeah, I was
Unless you're a libertarian. There's some people that disagree with you.
Well, no, yeah.
But I think you're bringing up the point of we could literally begin debating just this definition alone.
Yeah.
Because in this, there's so many ways that it could go. It's the distinction between right and wrong. My compass of right and wrong could be completely different than yours, Alex, or yours, Eric. And it's right in there is okay, what's right and what's wrong? It could be two different things.
And it's formed by so many layers
what's
of things. What's
good and bad behavior.
It's not just formed by one. Like someone might say, well, mine's based on the Bible. Okay. But then that's also based on maybe how you were taught the Bible from a parent or a guardian or another leader in the church or
your
whatever.
life
And
experiences that led you to this, or how you're interpreting scripture, the Bible.
And one of the things that I think it's been kind of a trend since the mid 2000s in Hollywood and storytelling in general has been kind of the likable villain in the way. Or, you've got shows like Breaking Bad or even more recently Yellowstone, and these themes of this is a morally bad person, and then they do such a good job at telling you the story that you start to feel empathy and compassion.
Or you're rooting for that.
You're rooting for it, And I mean, I'm not here to advocate for anyone to get into some sort of nefarious business, but I do think the closer you are to something that is morally gray, it's easier for you to at least empathize or understand why someone would go to make those decisions or follow that path. And I don't think it's always about saying, oh, well, that this story or whatever that you're watching is trying to tell you that bad is good. It's just that we've all been in situations that individually that we could probably share of like circumstances that happened where we had to make a kind of a morally gray decision that other people would look down on and go, why would you do that? That's terrible. But they've never experienced it. They've never been there. They've never been in that circumstance. So I don't know. That's why this topic is so challenging to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. We're coming off of last Sunday, being Juneteenth, and obviously that's when the Emancipation Proclamation was actually finally heard and recognized in the last state, and slaves were able to be free. So black men, women, children, it was finally like a liberation for them. And then obviously we have Dr. Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement, and he talked about this idea. One of the things as he's presenting, the idea of segregation and slavery, a lot of that had to do with people's thoughts on morality and what they were legislating and who could go to school where and how we valued human life, which gets all into this conversation. And he has a quote that sticks with me. He says, morality cannot be legislated. And I'll finish the quote and then give my thought. Morality cannot be legislated, but behavior can be regulated. The law may not change the heart, but it can restrain the heartless, or he's, the law can't keep a man from hating me, but it can keep a man from hanging me. I've heard people paraphrase it in that kind of way. And so, and we get into these conversations. I think one of the pointed conversations we have, and we've talked about this before, is gun control, where we go to the degree of saying guns don't kill people. People kill people, which is it's true, to the extent of taking this. Like, you can't legislate evil out of a person's heart. You just can't. You can't do it. Bad people are going to be bad people and find ways to break the law. Like, we've all heard that. I think those kinds of conversations, and there's so much truth to that. But at the same time, there are ways that help society, I think, flourish more. And then it becomes the idea or the debate around where do we agree, where do we find things that help the flourishment of society. And even that is, what is the flourishment of society? What does that look like? And so that's where all, I think, the breakdown begins to happen, when we just throw out like these ideas without getting into the nuance. And I think we talk about that so much on this podcast, is like, nuance is important in having these discussions. And so often, I think, hopefully one of our goals is to be able to open up conversations and to get us thinking about those, to challenge us to think about those, to be more empathetic, and not tell you how to think, but like how vital it is to think a little more broadly about perspective or our thoughts or those types of things. And so,
and I think even being intentional about what we're thinking about or how we're thinking, or it's not necessarily like we have to go down the list of like, okay, Eric, how do you feel about gambling? And now how do you feel about drinking? But it's being able to, I think why it's so important for us to have like a firm foundation and to be able to have some kind of compass or a lens that we're looking through, because We absolutely could go so many different ways. I think I love what you said, Alex, because there is some safety in what we do. I love like the dialogue that we can have, because I think a lot of times it's, okay, what's your opinion? What's your opinion? Now let's debate about it. And I think at least through legislation, we can have conversations, and I feel safe having conversations about, hey, how do we feel about this? Like even the Buzz Lightyear thing we talked about earlier, that might not be something that I'm going to dialogue. I would like internally think about, but I think even when it's like, hey, this is going on, I'm not sure how I feel about it. And us even coming together and, well, what do you think, Eric? What do you think, Alex? Like that's important. And we need people in this. And I think conversations, even if we disagree, are a good thing. And I think it kind of helps us, okay, if we're in the gray, there's a lot of like, could go either way. And so it's like the critical, it comes back to like the critical thinking. Where's my foundation? Like, what do I believe? Before you're on the spot and the spotlight's on you and you're like, well, okay, now what?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think at the core, every law is tied to a moral, you know, I mean, it's tied to a thought of helping, I think, society thrive. Like that's the hope around it. Whether it's laws about recycling or laws, you know, some places in the summer, for example, you can only use your sprinklers at a certain time because there becomes water shortages, or you can't burn things in Colorado during a certain time because it might, you know, cause an entire forest to you know, burn up or whatever. And so there's, in almost every aspect of our life, we can be faced with this kind of conversation of like, is this being legislated into our lives? And so how much people make in minimum wage, you know, who can smoke, gambling, how, like all of those things, this topic just, it undergirds a lot of that, which ultimately comes back to, you know, what you were saying earlier, Jess, where do our morals come from? And ultimately, I think in a Christian worldview, I think the fact that every human has this sense of morality is a thing, and it comes from somewhere. And there, I think, some universal morals that the majority of society agree on, like human life, not murdering, you know, those types of things. That it begs for a creator, for a moral being, for a deity to have written this onto our hearts. Romans 1 talks about, you know, a God who has revealed himself to all humans and has written the law on our hearts and what that looks like. And we're fallen people that I think have to recapture, okay, what does that mean? 10 Commandments, you know, is a pretty solid list of things that not a lot of people debate, you know, around what that looks like. Maybe like, if you believe God's existent or not, you should not take the Lord, you know, the name of the Lord your God in vain. But, you know, obeying your parents, not killing people, not stealing, those types of things are pretty universal, it seems.
So speaking of, you know, if we're in agreement that a lot of if the majority of laws are based on morals or morality, then do we think it's possible to legislate morality, or is that something that's not really a possibility? I mean, you hear different takes on it, and because I think when you say legislate, a lot of times people hear that as you're going to either force me to do something I don't want to do, or force me to do something, you know, or force others to do something I don't want them to do, or vice versa.
I think it's impossible not to have, you know, a society that functions well, and this is, again, my opinion, without some kind of governance and some kind of accountability and legislation, right and wrong, that holds people accountable. So I think that it's impossible to have a very good society that can thrive without some sort of legislation of morality. Again, where we get into the nuance is like, what is thriving, and then what are the things that actually, the legislations that lead to that happening, you know, more holistically as a society. And that's where it gets more and more difficult, because I want to think that I can in my own good conscience, I'll make every right choice and I'll follow the Spirit of God in every way. But, I need to see that sign on the road sometimes when I'm in a rush and I want to get somewhere and I'm just locked in on what I'm doing. I need to see that sign on the road that reminds me, slow down, and so it's annoying. And I want to be like, no one has the right to tell me how fast I want to drive in my car, or whatever, that might look like. But I'm like, okay, let's be honest, it saves lives.
And there's a narrative that's gone around in recent years. And I mean, it's not new. It's just maybe taken different forms about, the government's worthless. They can't do anything right. They're incompetent. And I think a lot of people have kind of carried that sentiment because of the way they see things happening around them and the way things are handled. This isn't necessarily an endorsement of this Netflix show, but there is a new series on Netflix called The G Word, which Adam Conover is on there from Adam Ruins Everything, if anyone ever watched that show. But he goes around and he looks into these government organizations and finds out what they actually do. And on one hand, he looks at something like FEMA that's just kind of a failure. It's been one of those things where it was a hodgepodge of a bunch of different government organizations that got through together, and they're like, "Here, go do this. Go help people in times of crisis." Well, it just doesn't work well. But then on the flip side, he's highlighting like USDA agents at meatpacking plants, and when you see what they do and the care that they have for these people that are highly trained to go in there and inspect the meat that we're going to eat, and that they actually are doing something that the majority of us would never want to do, but they have passion for it, and like they want to be there, and they know that they're protecting people from illness. And then the idea that people want to take that away and go, oh, well, we should just let meatpacking plants self-regulate. And it's like, well, but they're about the bottom line. So they're always, they're about making money, not about the health of society. And so to see these people in there, marking meat that's bad or whatever, and you're like, wow, that's such an interesting thing to be passionate about. But I'm so thankful that people are doing that, Or the other thing that he highlighted was the National Weather Service. So many of us take that for granted, and we like think, oh, well, that's, the guy the local weather guy, he goes out and figures that out, right? And it's like, well, no, there's a service that the government manages that tracks the weather, and all of these local places use that. There are military men and women that fly into the middle of hurricanes to figure out where they're headed. And I think sometimes it's like, oh, I just took for granted, oh, that's just the radar. They just can figure that out. They can map that out. But no, there's people that have to fly into the eye of the storm and put tracking devices in there to actually track the course of a hurricane. And they execute it masterfully every hurricane season. And it was just a crazy thing to watch, like them go up in the plane and do that. And there's things like that where it's like there are rules and guidelines and things that are legislated and that are protecting us and keeping us safe. And it's just there's certain things that it's hard to argue that, But then when you get into these issues that are on the forefront, the ones that everybody wants to talk about, the hot button things, that's where it's, that's the thing that everybody wants to be upset about or be outraged about.
But I also think it's different when we're talking about legislating like the food that we eat or the speed limit that we drive. There's a different feeling that comes when I even say the word vaccinations, legislating vaccinations or legislating abortion. They're instantly, like, to me, those things like are facts that don't necessarily have feelings. And then there's like this other section of legislation that brings in anger, sadness, confusion, frustration. The list goes on. And a lot of times they're not necessarily positive things that we're feeling. And so I think that that's where, I kind of like push comes to shove. I think that we do absolutely need to be governed. The question for me, like where my attention is, and obviously like I'm processing this in real time. So we're all but it's like, should the government legislate everything?
Yeah.
I don't want to, I'm not going to give all that up to the government. And that's not necessarily saying Jess is like right-wing conservative. No, I'm like really processing, because I do think that there's absolutely legislation that should happen. I want to be safe and protected, but then there's this other group of things. It's like, it's not an easy conclusion, right?
Yeah.
So it's like, okay, you can drive 25, you're driving 45, ticket, eat, like beginning to end, done. Like, this is how animals should be treated or packaged. But it's like, okay, vaccination is going into your body, or everybody's mandated to do this, then it feels different, because it's,
well, whatever
feels
one
personal.
affects us.
Yeah.
Anytime
Yeah.
something's going to actually have a personal effect toward you, you know, and we don't think about how often, you know, there is things that the USDA or other government organizations, it's just so much ingrained in who we are that we don't really think of.
We don't even see it.
Oh, that does affect, you know, me. Oh, when they do a recall on Jif peanut butter,
right.
that's affecting.
But even before they started inspecting the meat, I mean, like, people were dying from eating meat all the time, and we don't even think about it because it never even touched our generation. Like, we just
exactly.
we're just like, oh, they can't do anything right.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, they're literally saving your life on a daily basis by you not eating tainted meat.
Yeah. And so I think one of the things, and one of the beauties of our country and is that we have a system that is designed to allow people, you know, to democracy. I mean, it's we get to vote our people, we get to have conversations with people. And I've had, you know, the opportunity to sit down with people that are political leaders I agree with, disagree with, somewhat agree with, no one that I fully agree with. And man, the pressure, one, these are people, the pressure that they're feeling, that the weight that they're under, I really do think a lot of them actually want to do good. And again, and that's what they're driven by. But again, it's like, where do they define that good? Where do they, what is their essence of what a thriving society looks like? How has that even changed, you know, over the course of time? And so I think giving more grace to those people and understanding, man, the decisions and how to legislate is a difficult thing. And so I think, like, for example, one of the biggest probably faux pas in American history is what is it called? What is the title of this that I had in my head and I'm not remembering? Prohibition. There it is. So Prohibition, it was one of those things that pretty widely in the United States was like, we outlawed alcohol. You couldn't sell alcohol. Alcohol was not legal. And it was because of a lot of moral problems that they were seeing, the moral decay of the family, you know, people dying, you know, sickness, a lot of problems alcohol was causing. And so, like, all right, let's get rid of it. And if we get rid of it and we say it's illegal, then these problems go away. But what ended up happening was it created a whole new set of problems, you know, bootleggers, a lot more violence around alcohol. It created like a commodity, probably like we see on our war on drugs right now, on certain drugs. And so because of that, it created a whole new set of problems. And eventually, obviously, you can buy alcohol in the United States right now if you're a certain age and all those. And there's laws around that.
Yeah, I was going to say there is probably
about how much
legislation.
Consumption that can happen or not getting behind a vehicle or taking it with
alcohol
other
content, I'm sure.
Yeah, taking it with other alcohol content inside of beverage. Like all of those things are still a part of the legislation. So it's how and where we step in, how we learn, how we use science to learn new things about how these things do affect us. And then once we do learn the negatives of this, then it becomes like some of these things we didn't have a moral obligation because we didn't understand what it was doing to, like, you know, with the meat or sugar right now, I think is one of those things that people are debating about. Like, is there some kind of, as we look at obesity in our country, as we look at some of the issues that are happening and the cheapest of foods that are available to the most people that can't afford, like, is there a moral issue happening there with, like, what should processed things go into, you know, certain foods and all of this? So there becomes, as we discover more about science and what's in things and we put labels on things, there becomes more of a moral obligation for us to start to consider with these types of things. It's not just giving people free food, but or access to free food through our government, but what types of food, or, you know, people, I think, got upset about lunches a few years ago and the legislation that happened at school lunches, and you have to, you have to
I
take
think
a
that
fruit,
was that during Barack
a veggie,
Obama's
yeah.
presidency.
And
Because
that became a big deal.
Yeah.
But that was one of those things. It's like, as we're learning more in society, we become more
Yeah, but you think
morally.
even about like the food pyramid. When I was a kid, that was a big thing, and it's like telling you grain is the number one, thing to eat, and then like when you start to learn the history about that, and you realize that there's lobbyists that are behind that, then you start to distrust the government again, because you're like, oh, there's dairy lobbyists that are like, well, you're not telling them to eat enough cheese, so up the amount of cheese that they should eat, and so you realize all the inner workings of stuff that's going behind the scenes because of money, and that then you almost feel victimized at some point. Like, I was taught that eating this way was okay or whatever.
Yeah.
And it's crazy.
It is. So yeah, I think ultimately that's a resolution. Can't be found through all of legislation, but
I think to Jess's point earlier, it is when it is something that is directly controlling your body or your choices you can make with your body, which I think the abortion thing kind of goes both ways with that, though. And that debate, at least, because, you'll hear people talk about my body, my choice when it comes to vaccinations and abortion. And so I think but then there's things like gun control and vaccines that it are technically like a public health issue. It's like, if you don't want to get vaccinated, that should be your choice. But then on the other hand, someone could look at that and go, okay, well, but if you don't get vaccinated for something like COVID, then you're endangering, other people by making that choice. Same with guns. They can be used for good or for evil. And yeah, I don't know. So much of that is about affecting you personally and how directly it affects you.
And I even think about, I feel like it was even today, or was it yesterday, that and we're recording this on Wednesday, but they're debating enforcing more gun laws and what that looks like. And so even think about that. So maybe you feel a certain way about morally about guns and gun control. So we have that, how we feel about that. Then there's this other piece of us that also morally we are to respect the authority and like governance over us. So it's like, okay, now that you've got multiple moral things that you're bouncing up and down. So then it's like, what's the most important thing? Like, how do we navigate that? So
yeah, it is complex, and the more you dive into it, and the more you think about it with each situation, it gets more complex. I think one of the next things we'll see probably is legislation on the internet. And again, like so many of these things, I think the problem is like a gun is amoral. A gun is not moral or not. The internet is a tool. It's not moral or not. But the use of those and how they're used and the dangers behind them
there you go.
Are where the moral issues
there you go.
and the heart issues start to set in. And so like I mean obviously with the internet and privacy laws and those types of things, like more and more people I think are craving that to happen because of what IoT, Internet of Things, and all those things can provide for people. We're like, oh yikes. But the more we learn about that, the more we learn, okay, there's some pretty big moral issues when it comes to privacy on our devices and tracking of where we go and where we don't go, that we never even, 20 years ago, no one was thinking that you're going to have a moral conversation around the World Wide Web. Like it's just a tool that we can email people. And now all of a sudden it's opened up an ability to let humans flourish or not flourish. And what do we do with that? Identity issues are at the core of a lot of this stuff, and where flourishing comes from. And obviously, like as Christians, we have a standard that we believe in is Scripture and the Bible, and I think a history of seeing God's ways create flourishing. We did a series in Leviticus like 2 years ago, and there's a lot of legislation, it would feel like, of issues, morality, cleanliness, all those kinds of things that are like, that's silly, but it was a way that God was protecting and preserving a people to thrive. And we're able to see, like through biblical history, God's ways end up creating, thriving. A lot of the people groups that existed at the time of the Exodus and when Leviticus was taking place are not around anymore because there wasn't any kind of morality, not just a moral compass, but legislation or laws, rules that went along with that ended up preserving people. And so sometimes I think freedom is found in constraint, and we just have to realize that. And I think that like sometimes laws actually allow us to have more freedom, but it becomes difficult because we have pride. We all have agendas, whether we realize it or not, to help us, like not human flourishing thrive, but to help Alex thrive. That becomes the most important. The Ely family thriving ultimately becomes the most important thing to me. And so that's difficult.
And not just thriving, but your safety or whatever, your wealth, whatever, all of those things.
Health, well-being, all of those types of things.
They play a factor into it. All right. I feel like we kind of went all over the place. We've covered a lot. I think this is one of those conversations that is going to just be more ambiguous in nature because we're not setting out to have the answer, but I do think, even in preparing for this and as we discuss it, you just start to, you hope that you can understand someone else's perspective a little bit. And it's not to say that we need to rally behind one idea here, but at least understand the why. Why does someone feel this so strongly about something? What personal choices and upbringing and personality led to these things?
Yes.
And hopefully we can all continue to learn a little bit about each other.
And I think even when the title of this, Legislating Morality, that has so many different trails and facets. Like we've gone so many different places. Like you said, this would be a great question to even talk about in your community or around, I don't know, maybe not around the dinner table, depending who's at your dinner table, but like with your friends, like this is something that it's a really interesting question. And it's something that we've wrestled with. And I would just encourage people to take it the step further and have conversations. Like don't let it just sit here, but figure that out for yourself. Like, how do you feel about it?
Yeah. And I think it's a bridge topic, honestly, for, those who profess faith in Jesus and those who don't. That doesn't have to be a debate, but like it can, like I've had some conversations around the topic of morality that ultimately have led people to understanding more about God and more about God's plans and more about his plans actually for goodness and for human flourishing and for why maybe some of these things that feel like God is a buzzkill or doesn't want us to have any kind of fun in our lives, why he's just strict and, prude or whatever. The more we actually unleash, like, no, here's the heart behind some of these things. Here's why they exist. Here's some study and research of how the Christian worldview and Yahweh, the God that we believe in, actually does have a heart for human flourishing. And so if we're able to step back and have some of those conversations, and they'll be uncomfortable and probably more than just one and listen to people, then I think it actually is a great conversation to point people to God and his plan for us to have the best, most flourishing life that we can find.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think that does it for us today. And like we said earlier, we are going to be taking a little break for the month of July. So we'll be back in August with some more episodes. Again, thank you for everyone who listens on a weekly basis. We really do appreciate that. And we appreciate your feedback. So if you have any, you can send it to us at CCC Omaha on social media, or you can send an email directly to this podcast. That email address is podcast@cccomaha.org. Until next time, which will be about a month from now, we'll talk to you then.